and then others will be able to hear our reflections. Please bear with me while I scroll up. So I'm going to start by telling you a little bit about what's been happening on my street during the lockdown, and then I'm going to ask our other panellists to share more of what they've seen and observed and been involved in. So on my street, I knew my immediate neighbours before lockdown. We've lived here about 6 years. I knew the neighbours within a kind of couple of houses radius of where we live, and we had a little bit of social contact, but not huge amounts. Now, after about a week into lockdown, I was thinking about what I could do in terms of engaging with the streets, bearing in mind that it was quite a scary time. And on the Methodist website, the national website, there was the idea of starting a street WhatsApp group. And I thought, well, that's quite simple to do. So I put notes through my neighbours' doors saying, this is my number, I'm Emma. If you'd like to join in a street WhatsApp group, text me your number and I'll add you. And within a couple of days, we had about 20 households. I think we've now got 25 households in the WhatsApp group for my street. There's about 50 households in total on my street. And so I didn't really do very much after that. The WhatsApp group just kind of took off, and lots of people were writing notes to each other saying, I'm going to Aldi, does anyone want me? Which was great. And then someone said, hey, what about hanging some bunting? I live in a town in Essex, and elsewhere in the town we'd noticed that bunting was starting to go up. And so one lady who's a confident sewer started to sew bunting. There were a couple of others of us with sewing machines on our streets. There were others who didn't really like sewing or didn't feel confident but had spare fabric. So then people were leaving fabric on each other's doorsteps, and some people were cutting out bunting with their preschool children or homeschooled children, and others were sewing it beautifully using their sewing machines. And then in a safe social distancing way, we hung the bunting along the street, and in some cases across the street, slightly in violation of local council regulations. And it's been a lot of fun, and it's been great to see community being formed. But I'm sure my other panellists have some other great examples. So Tiz, Tracy and Jill, what are you seeing in your local areas that you feel is really good practice? Who'd like to start?
I go first just because I don't want to be last. I don't want to be last because I've got a bit of a confession to make, which is that I'm a mission enabler for our district. I've lived in the manse I live in now for 3 years, and it has been really hard to get to know people because I'm away and out so much. I live in an area where people know each other already. Mainly elderly, so they're mainly around in the day when I'm not. So it's been really, really lovely actually just to use this time to begin to love the area that I live in, to actually be here, to walk every day, to explore different streets, to say hello to people, to learn who lives where. And there is some creative stuff that goes on, but my experience hasn't been quite as positive as yours, so I thought I would say that at the beginning before the others join in.
Fantastic.
Hello, I'm Tiz.
We can see you.
Oh, hello. I've lived in my area for about 20 years. Prior to changing to work for the district, I was a youth worker in a church for 17 years. So I'm already quite built into my community. So we've been trying to work both with our church in its locality, but also with the local village as well, very much the community, the parish council, etc. So an example was around the VE Day stuff just last weekend. We had some stuff at church with some packs that people could come and collect if they wanted to, but working with the parish council and all sorts of stuff. So we've been doing some of that, but I think that comes out of sort of 20 years of being in the village, as it were. So I've had quite a good local experience. Yeah.
That's great. Tracy?
For me, I moved into my community only in June last year, so I was new to the community. I kind of knew the circuit steward who lived opposite, but that was about it. And one of the wonderful things that lockdown has brought is me getting to know my neighbours in the cul-de-sac a lot better. So that's been really, really good. And we've done a few things, different things. So I'd noticed, I mean, I've kind of one for nicking ideas as well, which is fine, I think. I'd seen on Facebook some people doing socially distanced coffee mornings in their street and things. And so I put a note through my neighbours' doors, the ones that I could see from my house, not the whole street, but the ones I could see, just to say, look, at 11 o'clock on Thursday, I'm going to go onto my drive with my cup of coffee and a piece of cake. If you fancy joining me, you know, at the end of your drive, then let's have a catch up and see how we're doing. And 4 of the 5 houses did that the first week, and then everybody did it when we did it a fortnight later. And it's been a nice way we've got some of them who were having to be isolated or shielded, so this was the nearest they were going to get to company. And others it was just a catch up, and that was really, really good. They want to do more of those. We've had people locally doing activity packs as well for children, which has been helpful. That's people in the community doing it, not the church. Somebody in the community put up a thank you tree as well. They wanted somewhere positive to place notices, you know, thanking people who've done things, that kind of stuff. So that's been really lovely. And then we've been responding with bereavement bags as well, for people who can't go to funerals, and been able to take them a bag of stuff and some kits for care homes as well.
So tell us about the bereavement bags, Tracy. I noticed that I follow you on Facebook, and I noticed that. I was curious to know more about that.
So yeah, I just took, Paul Wood had very kindly put together the act of worship if you can't attend a funeral. So I just put that into an A5 version. I put together some just prayers and readings and poems that I thought people might find helpful in the days following a funeral or running up to a funeral. A little tea light candle, a little cross, and a crocheted forget-me-not. There's something I've been reflecting on about forget-me-nots and people feeling forgotten and being a number in amongst all this. And then the community have now been crocheting by the 100 forget-me-nots that keep appearing on my doorstep, to going in bags. So we've been delivering those to people who either can't go to a funeral or will go back to an empty house straight after a funeral and have got nobody there to kind of support them ongoing.
Yeah, that sounds really beautiful, Tracy. And so it sounds as if some of the people that are crocheting the forget-me-nots, they're not necessarily people who are part of your church.
No, they're not. A lot of them are just people in the community. I don't have a church community because I'm in a district role, but it's a way of being encouraging. But I think a lot of them that have been doing that are people who would be isolated often anyway, and they would be housebound or whatever, and they feel like they can make a contribution. So it's in a small thing that they can do with the skills that they have. Yeah, so it's been something to brought them together.
Well, thank you all. Some really fabulous ideas to get us thinking towards the start of our webinar. What we'd like to do now is to put you into breakout rooms. So effectively, you're going into discussion groups. And someone in the chat has suggested that Dave. Okay, everybody, I think we're mostly back from our breakout rooms, and apologies, we had another teething problem there, in that I was halfway through giving instructions and then some of you couldn't hear me, so sorry about that. The question was very simple actually. It was, what community engagement practice have you seen and what did you think made it good? So I'm hoping that even those groups that didn't actually hear the question, hopefully we're talking about what they've seen near them. Now, we were planning to have some feedback using the chat function, but we are running behind time because of the couple of hitches that we've had. So I'm going to hand over to Tracy and Tiz, who have got some material prepared for us around tragedy and congregations. Tracy and Tiz, you happy for me to pass over to you now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then that'll get us back on track. Thanks so much.
Okay. So hi, I'm Tracy. And we just wanted to say at the beginning that we don't have all the answers. This isn't us coming in as experts, but we just wanted to share some thoughts and reflections and questions that we've had since lockdown started and maybe moving forward. We've also, after we've had some input, a little bit of input for us, which will only be about 5 minutes or so, then we'll go back into the breakout group so that you can consider some of those questions as well. And we started off by wanting to use a document that we'd come across quite early on in lockdown that was by the Tragedies and Christian Congregations Project. which talked a little bit about phases of crises and what happens in a community or a congregation. And so we wanted to use those. And I just want to give you, read out the introductory paragraph to the paper. It says, the nation, the world, it's not a shock event like a fire or a terrorist attack, but slowly there has built and is still worsening a crisis that shatters people's assumptions that the world is generally safe and reliable, and that all we have worked for in businesses, churches and communities will be fruitful. The loss of these assumptions, the breaking of connections between people, and the overwhelming of people's ordinary resources, all of these are characteristic of trauma. So it talks about trauma, that this is a trauma, and how people respond to those things. And so Mark's just going to highlight the 3 phases that the report talks about, and then we're going to break it into 3 sections, looking at it through the lens of Good Friday, Holy Saturday and Easter Sunday. Mark.
Hi, yeah, so this report was brought about by people looking at what happened to congregations following a tragic calamitous event. And so they've followed up by looking at what's happening in the COVID-19 period and recognizing that it's becoming a trauma rather than a mass localized but big event. So we're going to look at the 3 phases, and the first phase that they identify is the heroic phase. So immediately after an event takes place, the community responds by building an heroic response. And we've linked that really with Good Friday, and we're going to explain a little bit more about that in a moment. The second phase that they identified is the disillusionment phase, which may be when the situation doesn't improve as people think it should, or that it goes on longer than they hoped, and there's a bit of tiredness breaking in and people get disillusioned. And then the third phase that they identify, and we've linked that second phase rather with Easter Saturday, Holy Saturday. And then the third phase they identify in their report is like a hopeful reimagining, they call it. So a period where hope is reborn, where vision is created. And I guess we've already sensing some of that with people talking about a new normal. We can't go back to the way things were. And we've linked that very much with Easter Sunday and resurrection. But I think sometimes we need to go through the phases before we can get to the hopeful reimagining, rather than just jumping straight in there, I think. So we're going to look at that, and I'm going to talk a little bit for a few minutes a bit about the heroic stage, and then Tracy's going to talk a bit about the disillusion phase. So I was going to share a PowerPoint with you, but I've decided not to because the icon it gave for this was a bit weird. PowerPoint made a funny face, but essentially we've identified, maybe in your breakout rooms, there's loads and loads of really interesting things happening in and around our communities, and they are led in part by the church, by our local churches, by our circuits, by districts, whatever, but also just by our local communities. And we heard examples of people gathering in their streets, doing coffee mornings, that type of stuff, with the local council looking for volunteers, all sorts of things happening. So there's been a growth. I don't know how many of you are on Facebook, but in the setting I'm in, our village has a Facebook page. The villages around us have their own Facebook pages. So there's been this kind of really interesting response mechanism. I think it's also been mentioned about looking out for neighbours, getting to know people that you didn't know before, doing shopping for them and whatever. So there's loads of different ways in which the community is responding. Also was mentioned earlier was that the Thursday evening clapping for the NHS and key workers. And so, you know, that sense of wanting to show support. I don't know about you, but my area, my street, I don't know whether it turned into a competition to see who can bang their wooden spoon on their metal saucepan the loudest. One neighbour complained the other day that one of her daughters had broken the wooden spoon. So, but there's been that sense. My daughter works in a co-op in a gap year, and she feels very special as a key worker, getting lots of support, but also actually sometimes some hint of frustration in there, which may be, as Tracy will talk about in a moment, that beginning of that disillusionment phase. Without getting too political, we have a government narrative that talks about defeating the enemy of this virus, overcoming the mugger, and it talks about that rallying kind of and heroic response. So that's the backdrop, and as a church we have a Christian message to share within that, and we reflected a bit about the Good Friday story. Now, I don't think, even at its worst, COVID-19 is quite Good Friday, but it gives us an image of death and the loss of hope, the possible shift that's taking place. I guess if you were one of Jesus's disciples on Good Friday, your reaction to the cross would be quite different on the day. You would have been thrown by it. And I'm 54, and never before in my lifetime have we been in lockdown. So suddenly we are facing with an unprecedented situation. The lockdown announcement on that day was just massive. My daughter was out with her boyfriend celebrating his birthday, and suddenly, was she still supposed to be out? Was she supposed to come home? All this kind of language, this very sudden change was taking place. And on the cross, you may remember, Jesus looks down from the cross and calls out to his friends, his disciples, and asks them to step up and look after his mother and his brothers. And in that, I guess, we have an image of our response. What is it we're trying to do? We're trying to stand with and alongside our communities and our feelings. So, yeah, we're going to move into, do we just want to go straight into the disillusionment, or do we want to have a breakout room?
No, I think we're going to go into groups. I think it's, so we're wanting to have a think about, you know, the heroic phase is about energy and kind of everybody trying to do their thing, and everybody's galvanized. We're going to do this, we can do this. And that's what this sort of first phase is. So in your groups, we'll have a chat about how that seems to be presenting itself in your community, or maybe with your church or with your street. What's been that kind of energy that you've seen that maybe you haven't seen before? Is that okay? So we're going to have 5 minutes in breakout groups, then we're going to come back and we'll have a look at that next phase, the disillusionment phase. Okay?
Great, thank you. It is. And David is going to put us into groups now.
Thank you. Okay, so what I want to say as well, that these 3 phases, we're not talking about rigid phases that come with timescales either, and there will be overlap as well, and this is just a model. There is nothing perfect in any model. So the second phase that the project talk about is this disillusionment phase, which we're relating a little bit maybe to Holy Saturday, but again, this is not, there's nothing rigid in this. It's trying to find some way of connecting with some of the language and imagery that we have as a church. And in some areas, I've been observing through social media and conversations, there's been a sense of wanting to move from that first phase of heroicism, wanting to move and have a little acknowledgement of those who've maybe whose lives have been transformed by this. That there's a lot of death has been involved in this. There's physical death. We know there are thousands of people who've lost somebody, and that is absolutely vital that we don't forget that. But there's also a lot of loss in other ways. So people have been furloughed, they've lost their sense of maybe identity that they found through their work. They've maybe lost an income, they've lost their job, they've lost access to seeing family. There's all sorts of things that people are grieving. And so we can't get back onto getting back to normal that quickly. Business isn't as usual. Situations are going to change forever. And so I've been reading Jo Cox-Darling's book, Finding God in a Culture of Fear. And it was written last year before COVID-19, but somehow what she has written has actually been quite prophetic and so easy to read through the lens of COVID-19. And it's only quite a short book, but it's been really helpful. And she uses various passages in the Bible to sort of make some connections. I'm just going to very quickly gloss over them rather than read them because we haven't got long. But she uses the passage in Joel chapter 2 to look at community in crisis and coming through crisis. And she says of that chapter, society was broken and divided, and the people were in the midst of lamenting all that they had lost. They were frightened and they felt alone. And maybe that feels quite true for us at the moment. That's some of the feelings that are going on. And Jo uses a phrase which I think was quite prophetic, considering it was written well before we were in this situation. And she says, the world is broken and some things don't get fixed. Things hurt, and it's important not to let those emotions fade before their time. In the Newcastle upon Tyne district, one of our superintendents shared with us a reading from the Exodus story about how God was speaking to him through it. And although a completely different story of pain and loss, there were some parallels. There were clearly some phases to the exiled Israelites' story. A resignation to their situation, a new normal, tough as it was, then the anger and the disillusionment phase, and so on. And Walter Brueggemann also refers to the analogy of exile where hope fits into the narrative. And he claims that the positive in the exile analogy is how there is space to grieve, mourn, and lament. Hope can only be experienced by a community if they are allowed to grieve and lament, to have those deep feelings and experiences acknowledged and known. And Jo goes on to suggest that laments enable there to be beauty, craft, and artistry, even hope, when they are authentic, raw, and visceral. So if we go back to the Easter story, between the death and the resurrection in that story was grief. There was real grief, lock yourself away kind of grief. And that Saturday between Good Friday and Easter Sunday is often referred to as Holy Saturday. There is holiness in the grief, in the disillusionment, and we can't skip over it. And grief will go on for some time post-lockdown. As we said, people have lost people. There is going to be a compound, their grief is going to be compounded because of social distancing and all sorts of things. But there is more heartache to come once lockdown is lifted. More jobs will go. More companies will close. Many of our churches are likely to close. The financial crash that will probably happen in some form will also cause long-term issues. So we can't rush into the what's next. And part of that disillusionment phase comes with anger, it comes with emotion. It isn't a nice kind of, okay, we're in between, we've had the heroic phase, and now we're going to think about what's going to come next. We have to acknowledge a lot of that hurt and lament that is to come. People are grieving, and we can't move on and just dismiss those feelings. So how do we do that? And you might see this disillusionment phase also comes with some anger at why things have happened, what's got us there. And I think we're going to be in two phases of disillusionment. I think we're beginning to see a little bit of that disillusionment in the media, in the press, where people are beginning to look for people to blame. And that's part of the disillusionment phase. And they're angry. We're angry that care homes have had to lose more people because people haven't done things, that kind of thing. That is part of that disillusionment phase. And then there will probably come later on, when we have had more of the lockdown has eased, we'll get a greater sense of that disillusionment. And when there'll be inquiries and all sorts of things, we're going to have to live with that disillusionment for some time. So we're going to go back into our groups and have a little think about that disillusionment phase, the grieving and lamenting, and have a think about, do you think that you've seen some signs of that disillusionment already? And also, what might that disillusionment look like once things have lifted a little bit? How's that going to feel? Or even if you prefer, you might want to focus on how we can enable grief and lament in our churches and our communities in this time now and as we move forward. Okay, so we're going to go into groups for 5 minutes, the same as before, and have a think about those. I'm going to put those little questions in the chat box for you as well. Okay. So we've talked about this sort of heroic phase, and we've talked about a disillusionment phase. We've talked about a bit about Good Friday, holding the grief of Holy Saturday, and then this kind of how we look at the third phase, which is this hopeful reimagination, the resurrection hope. I'm not sure how Dave and Tiz and I are going to do this bit, but we're going to, I'll maybe say my first bit and then let him carry on, if that's okay. But I think we have to be careful that we don't try and move on too quickly from this. We know that there are folk in our congregations for whom, especially those who don't connect online and don't feel that sense of community that maybe a lot of us have been able to hold virtually, that just desire to get back in their building and go back to normal, because that's the safe place. That's the place that they know where they live, where they are, what their identity is, that kind of thing. But in doing so, if we do that, we engage in dismissing so much of the grief, the lament, the story that is going on at the moment. Grief and experiences like this change us personally, and they change society, and therefore they have to change the church. And I've heard a number of folk in articles recently, especially some of our Church of England friends who are beginning to put articles and blogs together, and who are craving that going back into their building because that's where they want to be. They, which I can understand where they're coming from. But interestingly, Stephen Cottrell, who's going to be the new Archbishop of York, in the Daily Telegraph on Monday, has written an article about people talking about, not our churches being closed, being members only because we're closed and we're doing it on Zoom. And he sort of says, I think we're missing something here. And he says, of course we long for our church buildings to reopen, but when they do, it won't be business as usual, partly because we're discovering new ways of serving our communities. He is not here, he is risen. And I found that quite helpful. But it's not just about serving our communities that's changed, but we have to acknowledge the change that's happening in individuals' lives and in our communities' lives, that people are suddenly not there who were there before. We might want to physically meet as community again, but we need to look at where God is, who he's with, and join in with some of that. And he might not be immediately in our buildings. And Stephen Cottrell talks about the fact that in the days past, straight away after the resurrection, that the disciples didn't recognize Jesus. And so how do we move forward and continue to help people post-lockdown to recognize Jesus in this new life that we're going to experience? And so people have begun to make some parallels with the stories in Acts, particularly around Pentecost, and obviously we're about to celebrate Pentecost not very long away, and there are maybe some parallels we can draw with that too. And Jo Cox-Darling uses that analogy, and not obviously for COVID specifically, but it's relatable. And she says, the disciples were afraid of being alone. They were afraid that the previous few days were some sort of communal psychotic episode. They were afraid for their own safety. They were afraid because they did not know what was going to happen next. And maybe that's how many of us and our congregations feel at the moment. They are real emotions. We don't know what's going to come next. and we desire to try and put that right because that's a natural inclination. But if we're going to hold what happened in the last sort of couple of days, the Easter story, and what's happened and going to happen in the next months with this COVID, then actually what's going to happen next is going to look quite different to maybe what we expect. So we have to do that deep listening and watching our communities and individuals and trying to sense the mood, trying to sense what's needed. And actually the whole thing around grieving and lamenting is probably going to be an ongoing issue. This is not simply having some memorial services in the future. People have had to hold their grief almost in this holding place at the moment. They haven't been able to say goodbye properly. There's all sorts of grieving and lamenting to come. Tiz, do you want to carry on with that?
Yeah, so I was in Matthew chapter 16, verses 2 and 3, and the leaders demanded a miraculous sign, and Jesus replied, "You know the saying, red sky at night means a fair weather tomorrow. Red sky in the morning means foul weather all day. You know how to interpret the weather signs in the sky, but you don't know how to interpret the signs of the times." And I think there's a lot for us to wrestle with about interpreting the signs of the times. What does it mean? And I suspect there's 200 plus people in this on this session this afternoon, and almost 200 different interpretations of what the signs are saying. And it will be based on what we hope for and what we imagine. And but we still have to wrestle that as a people. We have to kind of discern, I think. And so I think the disillusion phrase, although I'm an optimistic kind of person and my glass is often half full, but we still have to wrestle, I think, in the darkness of what we're going to go through, to discern what is coming. We were talking in the last breakout group about one of the things that there will be a growing sense of disillusionment with is the lack of communion, the breaking of bread, that meal together. But what does that then show us about the future? What does that gonna grow in us? We're also talking about how maybe one person said that they don't feel their churches want to get back together just at the moment because they're learning a lot. So it's a really interesting phase. What does it mean? So, my background is youth work. So I have always had a heart for young people, and I long to see churches with lots and lots of young people in. But that does not mean that's the only vision. That does not mean I'm right. My wife would often dispute that anyway. But we have to look for ways of interpreting what God is saying to us in this time. How are we going to move forward? How is the Methodist Church, the people called Methodists, how are we going to live out our calling? Our background is about reshaping the church. Our background is about being a movement of reform and change. How do we go back into that? How do we reshape ourselves going forward? We need to listen. We need to deeply listen to people, to those in our communities. We mentioned a passage already in Joel, but in Joel it also talks about the Spirit is poured out on all people. And that does mean those inside the church, but also those outside the church. We need to listen and to be guided by that Spirit. So we hope that that's been of some use to you in terms of trying to give you a bit of a framework for looking at how we can engage with our communities through these traumatic days. I had a meeting with somebody on Zoom, social distance and all that kind of stuff, and there were 3 of us in a meeting. Somebody who just started doing youth work just before lockdown happened, and 2 of us who had experience going up to 60 years of doing youth work, and we had nothing really to offer, like in some ways. because it's so different. So we hope that today maybe we've given you or begun to help you flesh out some theological reflection on where we are and where we're going.
Yeah, we did say we didn't have the answers. And put
Yeah.
them down. We just want to prompt some of the conversation. And
Yeah.
I think we're going to move into some sort of conversation through chat box and through response. Is that right, Emma?
Absolutely. So I've been making a note of people's questions from the chat window. The chat kind of moves on quite quickly, so I've been scribbling your questions down as I go. So Neil Manthorpe asked, how do we enable laments online? Interesting. What, any of our panelists, Jill, Tiz, Tracy, what do we think? How can we do that?
I don't know if anybody saw the link that just whizzed past on chat, but Church Missionary Society have had a really interesting project. They were looking at lament for Lent anyway, and they've got a thing called Lament Space, which has been really fascinating. So you can actually write on there what your laments are. It's just a very, very small scale thing, but I just think it's an interesting online project, really, to say we're not all about celebration, we're also about lamenting.
Yeah.
One of the things that I was aware of in this community, I didn't want anybody to feel that the person they'd lost had been forgotten in amongst of the numbers, and the fact that people wouldn't necessarily know they'd lost somebody because they weren't going to come into contact with them at the supermarket or wherever to hear the information. It wasn't going to be the death announcements, that kind of thing. And so we produced a large image of a forget-me-not and suggested to people that they could put it in their window if they've lost somebody, so that everybody going past knows that somebody in that household is grieving, actually, and that maybe they can put a note through the door even if they don't know them, or if they do know them, to send them a message. That there's something about alerting people that there is grief going on when at the moment you can't see it. That was just a simple idea, and I know people have been looking at the possibility of online wakes. I'm not sure what those would look like, and I don't think they're a replacement for something that will come afterwards, but it might be a holding place again. Don't know if anybody else got any ideas.
Piers, were you trying to speak as well?
No, mine's very simple. I like a band called Rend Collective, who are Irish, and they jig around a lot and whatever, but they have a great song on their album called Good News called Come Weep With Me. And they tell a story about it, but for me, that's been my soundtrack song in these days. And what we're also lamenting isn't always just death. That's hugely significant. But one of my daughters is going to turn 18 in a couple of weeks' time. The idea of, there's these milestones, these rites of passages that a generation, in a sense, are missing out on. So there's a lot of other stuff there's going to be lament, that lament goes on and on. So I don't know what Gen Z will be talked about in the future, but I think pandemic may feature very strongly in our youngest generation's worldview. I think it will shape their lives in a very profound way.
Thank you.
Emma, can I just say a couple of other things?
Please.
Yeah, so I think one of the things I've been lamenting personally is just the injustice yet again of the proportions of people from BAME communities that have been affected so badly by this, and I kind of feel we have a real calling as a church to be outspoken about that and not to let it go unnoticed, because actually if you talk to anybody from the Black community, they will have had close family friends who've died, and that's been the case with the friends that I've got. And I'm not sure that, I think a lot of white communities are not really acknowledging that. So I think there's also a need to kind of speak out loud about things which we should all be lamenting, but perhaps some people are unaware of. That was one thing. And the other thing just to say was that I've been involved in a new little Christian community really that had just started before lockdown and went on to Line, and so we've been meeting weekly, and the people there who hadn't been in church for donkey's years or not since they were children, and it's just been really interesting how initially we were doing what Tiz and Tracy have hopefully helped us to recognise. We're all being like jolly and cheerful, and isn't it great we can meet and all that. We're all trying to keep upbeat with each other, and then just gradually people are getting more real with each other, and it's just providing a small group space for actually talking about things honestly, which has been a really, really interesting thing. I hadn't anticipated at the beginning, but just exactly what we've been talking about really.
Thank
I
you.
think there's something as well that, you know, obviously Barbara and Clive have been talking about what's the story this year, and I think there's something very important how we are going to record and hold and hear the stories of experiences for grief, lament, and all sorts through this, you know, whatever that looks like to each individual. And maybe there's something for the church in how we go about recording that or holding that and allowing people to share that. And I think that's, you know, it's been a real pertinent kind of priority for them this year, I think.
We've got a couple more questions. There's been quite a few, so I've had to pick and choose, I'm afraid. But Peter Hibbert's asked, what if you're out of step with the phase of those around you? That's an interesting one. If perhaps you're in the disillusionment phase and everyone around you is still trying to be chipper or whatever.
Can I say something
Please.
into that? So we've been meeting in our house group on Zoom every week, and most of us have been in that heroic, phase. But one of my friends in my house group, he works with adults with learning difficulties for the county council, and has been redeployed from that centre because they've closed the centre into a nursing home run by the council, and he's felt very disillusioned right from the very beginning, almost. And so I don't want to, in some ways it was challenging to work out how to walk with him through that. But actually it was also very helpful for the rest of us to have a glimpse, if you like, of that it's okay not to be okay, which I know is a good mental health message anyway, but particularly right now in the disillusion phase, maybe it's okay to be disillusioned. It's a part of the process, and now he's beginning to imagine other things, if you see, and so he's going to probably help us when we're all a bit flat, if you want. I don't know, but that's a private, that's a personal experience.
And I think, as we said at the beginning, these are not hard and fast, rigid, time-scaled phases, and people are going to feel them at different times. Just with grief, the stages of grief are often felt differently by different people, and different phases of grief come at different times, and that's okay. Somebody's put on, it's not going to be tidy in terms of phases, and it isn't. It's going to be messy, and that's okay. It really is okay, and there'll be things that we can learn from them. And I think actually the people who were in disillusionment at the beginning are the people who are going to maybe give us some of the hope and the heroism and the energy that we need when we're all beginning to flag. You need people who are going to be there to pick people up a little bit, because this is going to go on for a while.
So a couple of people have picked up the idea about pause. So Anne Lett asked, what about churches that are just exhausted? They haven't energy for this heroism. And then Mike Redshaw and Helen Harrell have also commented about the idea of pause. Is that okay? Are we allowed to do that, to take some time out?
It's funny, isn't it? Because we've just asked, are we allowed, and what happens if we're out of sync? But maybe there's something about, we're all called to be ourselves, and in mission we're all called to be ourselves and to be honest about who we are. So yeah, it's definitely okay. I mean, I felt very guilty at the beginning because our house was suddenly, it's quite a small manse, and it was suddenly full of people, including a grandchild, and still trying to do a full-time job, and I felt like I couldn't do much. And Emma knows I nearly ducked out of this webinar thinking I can't do any more. But it's really interesting how I think, we just have to do we have to do what we can do for God in the way we can do it at the time we can do it. And I think pausing is brilliant.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I know for the first few weeks I had to spend time pausing because I didn't know who I was in this. I didn't know what my role was going to be. Everything was different. And so I had to pause earlier on, but some people have had the busyness maybe of, right, I've got to sort a church out, I've got to do the church organisation, everything else, and now they need that pause to think, okay, what's God saying now? If we don't stop, we don't hear.
Somebody just asked for how long, Emma, and I had in my own life a whole year where I didn't go to church at all, and it was the most significant year of my life. And then I was in a church once where we decided all we could do was just the very, very, very basics. And we said, well, let's just do the very basics for a year. Let's come to church on Sunday and do nothing else at all. And by the end of that year, we'd really sensed what we should go back to and what we should change. And it took a year. Don't know how long this took.
Obviously, we talk a lot about being in the light, but there's also darkness, and so there is time to rest, and there is time that is part of life. There is light and there is darkness, and so the pause. I don't know that you can give that a time frame, but it's a vitally important part of our growth, I think.
Can I come in? And can I come in?
Please.
I think one of the experience, we have a group of doctors, medical doctors, we meet together monthly before the COVID started, to have a kind of moral support. Most of them are not Christians, non-Christian or other religions, but they come together for prayer. So I, as a chaplain's team, I involved with them prayer. Now then COVID started, they are on the front line. Out of 7 doctors, 4 of them are off sick now. They are recovering from the virus now. The one thing they try to remind me, and refocus, don't just to dwell on that one. Something you need to refocus. If you're really struggling in the particular area, or grief or sorrow, you need to refocus something else. I think psychologically they will advise you to talk about the person who was already gone. At the same time, you also need to refocus. If you don't refocus, you will just go under over and sorrow and lamentation too. So that is a part of the medical doctors. They are advising us to don't dwell on it, just refocus something differently. For example, I think Jill said earlier, going back to church is a hard thing after you have been through the kind of grief or some kind of death in your family. But refocusing on something else will give you more boosting for it to come out. Not immediately. It will take time. But you need to refocus all the time. Whatever you can do within yourself. The medical doctors they are not Christian background. They said if you really hold on that one, it will eat you out.
Thank you, everybody. I've just taken back the hosting from you, David, in case you're worried that suddenly the computer isn't letting you do anything. It's 3:30. And we do like to finish when we say we're going to finish. I think some of the panellists are perhaps going to hang around so we can have a bit of a debrief. It has been an experiment today. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you have really enjoyed it. I'm very grateful to all of our panellists who've taken risks in doing a webinar when none of us have done one before. We will have some learning points, I'm sure. The link that you used to join the webinar today is going to be the same link for all of the other webinars. So if any of you have spent 20 minutes trying to get in, hold on to that link, copy, paste it, save it somewhere. It'll be the same link next time and the time after that. Do please share on social media, let people know about this webinar series if you found it helpful. We've got our next webinar next Tuesday. Not all of our webinars will be on Tuesdays, just happens to be that the first 2 are. So next Tuesday afternoon, we're going to be thinking about evangelism, and we've got a different panel for you. We've got scheduled webinars on leadership, that's on the 3rd of June, and we've now confirmed that the 26th of May is going to be webinar 4. So webinar 4 is going to happen before webinar 3. Just to be really confusing, folks. So that's going to be our Missio Dei webinar, exploring God's mission through the church. As for today, we'll have some content to offer you. We'll have some conversation together. We'll be inviting you to participate as much as possible, obviously within the bounds of a large meeting, and therefore we're having to mute you most of the time. So thank you so much. If you'd like to offer any feedback, the easiest way will be to email it to me, nashe@methodistchurch.org.uk, and you can find my email address on the website. Do keep checking the website for details of upcoming webinars. The ones I've mentioned are not the only ones, there are going to be more to come. So thank you very much, great to see you today, and I'll ask the panellists to just stay on for a moment so I can congratulate them. Thanks everybody.
Can you stop the recording?